Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel, Israel on Foot. I'm your host, Steve the Tour Guide, and I'm coming to you this afternoon from none other than King David's Palace, which is in the city of David on the southern slope of Mount Zion. And the ruins of this palace sit atop a massive and monumental wall that we've already observed twice in the previous episodes from the Mount of Olives. Here's a view looking up toward the ruins of the palace from the bottom of that wall. Come on, let's go down and explore the ruins together. Now just keep in mind as we descend the staircase here, it's somewhat dark because the ruins are kept under an awning in order to protect them from the elements. But even if we were in direct sunlight, typically, as it relates to archaeology in general, you won't see much above the knee or waist level. And this is owing to 3 millennia of a combination of wars and earthquakes and the clearing away of buildings of earlier eras to make room for buildings of later eras. These 3 things combined have reduced the footprint, if not totally erased, most of the vestiges of this period, known as the First Temple period or monarchy. But thankfully, at least some vestige of what we believe to be David's palace was left for posterity despite all of these aforementioned destructive forces. Now you should be asking yourself, or better yet asking me, Steve, by what authority can you claim that these ruins are King David's palace? Steve, that sounds sensational. Now level with us, Steve. Are you a sensationalist? Well, that's a really legitimate question, which deserves to be addressed. Now, before I address this specific site, let me explain how we date any archaeological find. Basically, we date strata of archaeology by dating various objects found within that stratum, such as pottery shards, which can easily and competently be dated. Several centuries after this era of the monarchy, coinage would also be invented, and thus later strata can also be dated based on a combination of pottery shards and coins found in them. Lastly, the style of construction can also betray the era of a building or even a boat. For example, several episodes from now, when we are in the Galilee, I will show you a 2,000-year-old boat nicknamed the Jesus Boat because it is believed to date to Jesus' own generation. Now, how do we know that? By both the manner in which the boat was constructed, which was unique to that first century, as well as by a ceramic oil lamp that was found in the boat, whose design was also unique to that generation. So based on these parameters, we can confidently state that the ruins of this building date to 1000 BC, to King David's time. Be that as it may, how do we know we're talking about King David's palace and not some other contemporary building? Well, the chief archaeologist who oversaw the excavation of this site, Eilat Mazar, offers the following features related to this building to argue on behalf that this is most likely King David's palace. Firstly, the building is located in the correct vicinity according to 2 Samuel 5:17, which says that David went down from the palace to the fortress of Zion, which would have had to have been south of here, further down the slope of Mount Zion. This building meets this prerequisite as being situated north of and above the outer limits of the former Canaanite city of Jebus, wherein that fortress was located. A second argument on behalf of this structure being King David's palace is the sheer size of the structure and the girth of its walls, some of which are 6 to 8 feet wide, and suggests that the building was constructed at a great cost, too great a cost to be borne by a private citizen of those times, but well within the grasp of a kingdom collecting tribute from its subjects among conquered peoples and neighbors. A third point raised on behalf of this being King David's palace is, yes, that massive wall that we seem to be unable to get away from, and which we have already viewed several times. This wall, located just below the palace, is the largest structure from that same era ever found in the country, and betrays an ingenuity and imagination, as well as a significant expense in erecting it, which again suggests that it was a government project and not the result of a private citizen's initiative. The last proof, if you will, that I will cite in support of this being King David's palace are the remains of a 5-foot-long proto-Iola capital that must have once been part of this building. The specimen is the most beautiful and elegant proto-Iola capital ever found in Israel, and suggests it once graced no less magnificent a building than a royal palace. All right, enough already with these dead stones and archaeology. Let's bring this stuff to life. I now want to conclude this video by relating to you one of the most famous stories in the Bible. Not only that, the story happened right here on these premises. I'm talking about none other than the story of David and Bathsheba, which also happened to be one of the defining episodes of King David's life. The story can be found in the book of 2 Samuel, chapters 11 and 12, and begins with the following verse. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. Now we have an immediate problem. In last week's episode, I explained to you that each successive king of Israel, on the day of their coronation, was anointed the Messiah of Israel, and they were to represent or do the bidding of their father, the real king of Israel, Yahweh. What in particular were they supposed to do? Well, two things. To judge righteously Yahweh's nation, the nation of Israel, and to wage wars on behalf of Yahweh against his enemies, most of whom were enemies of Israel. Now, accordingly, David should have been in the thick of things in the battle raging in what our story calls Rabbah. Today that's known as Rabbath Ammon, and our next door neighbor, Jordan, is their capital city. Was David in the thick of things? Was he leading the charge? No. According to our story, David stayed behind to enjoy his cozy palace in Jerusalem, and therefore he left himself vulnerable for what followed. Now the story continues to tell us that late one afternoon, David arose from his couch and walked out onto the palace's roof, from which he beheld the beautiful Bathsheba bathing below. Upon inquiring as to who she was, he ordered his servants to bring her up to him. The rest of the story reads like an episode of General Hospital, Days of Our Lives, or As the World Turns. After some time passes, Bathsheba returns word to David that she's become pregnant. Now our hero David has a serious problem, and therefore he recalls Uriah from the battlefield, hoping that while Uriah is home on furlough from the army, he sleeps with his wife and thinks the baby to be born is his. But Uriah refuses to enjoy the intimacy of his wife, even for one evening, citing the hardships of his comrades left behind at the battle outside of Ammon. David then invites Uriah to dine with him one evening in order to get him drunk, hoping that if inebriated, then Uriah will go home and sleep with his wife. But this too failed, and David was left in a real bind. So David sent Uriah back to the battle with a letter to his commander Joab to situate Uriah in the thick of the fighting by the city wall in order to increase the likelihood of his being killed, which he was. Upon hearing of Uriah's death, David takes Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, to be his own wife. David, the adulterer, becomes David, the murderer, which leads to one of my favorite scenes in the Bible, Nathan confronting David with this grievous sin. Now, why do I love this story so much? It's because it features one of the oldest parables in the Bible. Now, for those of you from Christian backgrounds, you probably know what a parable is, as they comprise the main medium of Jesus' teaching style. But for those of you that don't know what a parable is, just know that it is a fictitious story that represents metaphorically a profound truth. Now God sends Nathan to confront him with the following parable. There were two men in a certain city, one who was very wealthy and owned a vast flock of sheep, while the other was so poor that he only had a single ewe lamb, which was so precious to him that it basically functioned as his pet. She ate morsels of food from his own hand and even slept with him in bed. Now, this is another reason why I love this story. You see, I'm one of those individuals who loves animals more than people. And already Nathan has my own attention, not just David's. One day, the rich man receives a guest from out of town, and rather than slaughter a lamb from his own vast reserves of sheep, he slaughters that poor man's lone and precious pet sheep to serve his guest. Now, I'm getting pretty ticked off, but so did David, because when David heard this, he became enraged and declared that that scoundrel, that rich man, deserved to die right then and there. To which Nathan declared to David, "You are that man." You see, David was once a poor shepherd boy who could relate to the bereaved shepherd in the parable. As king of Israel, David could have any woman of his choosing. In fact, he already had a dozen. But he wasn't satisfied, so he took the precious wife of his much poorer subject Uriah before murdering him. This irked God, and God sent Nathan to tell him that this was a gross sin in his eyes. Yet God did not put David to death as David wanted to put that rich man in the parable to death. God had mercy on David by forgiving his sin, even though he providentially had the fruit of David's adultery with Bathsheba, the child that was yet to be born, die. What's the end of the story here? Well, that ending may surprise you. You see, David, the adulterer / murderer, went on to become Israel's most beloved king. In fact, so beloved that he would become a prototype of that person I mentioned in last week's lesson, the eschatological Messiah. Did you know, for instance, to this day, when the Jewish people are enamored with a politician or with a leader, they'll often hoist him upon their shoulders and proclaim, sorry, but I had to cut the video because none other than Benjamin Netanyahu's motorcade was passing by as I was about to mention him. I happen to live near the place of his residence, as well as the Knesset, the Parliament building, and it's common to hear that motorcade go by. Well, anyway, I was saying that when Israel is enamored with one of its politicians or leaders, such as a Netanyahu, they'll often hoist that leader upon their shoulders and pronounce, and I'll say it in Hebrew, David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam, which is to say that David the king still lives and exists. Now, they're not claiming that a guy like Netanyahu is the Messiah. What they're saying with that chant and that moment of euphoria, be it an election victory, is that their hope is in that eschatological Messiah who will one day come, a scion of David's line, who will restore the nation to its glory and bless it with peace both internally as well externally vis-a-vis its enemies. Now, if God can do that with a person who is a deeply flawed king, what can he do with the rest of us who are flawed people? It should give us hope that there's a redeemable side to all of us. God saw something in David that he considered redeemable. The Bible says that God saw within David a heart after his own. Now you may ask, Steve, how's that possible? David, the murderer, adulterer, what could God possibly see in his heart to say that he had a heart after his own? But you see, God is the judge of all things, and he's the reader of all hearts. And I can't stand in place of judgment of King David, and I'm happy that no one can stand in judgment of me. Ultimately, God is judge. And hopefully God sees something redeemable in this flawed person so that one day I can amount to something and you can amount to something. I'm hoping that one day I amount to more than just an average YouTuber. But for now, that is what I am, a YouTuber struggling to make his way through the life of being an unemployed tour guide, which leads me to say, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the video channel, as well as hit that bell icon to be notified of new videos as I release them. And lastly, please consider becoming a monthly patron of the channel. You can see the link to my Patreon page beneath the video. That's all I have to say for now. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode.